On the anniversary of a tragedy, the townspeople of Oakridge gather at a small monument tucked beside the schoolyard. Candles flicker against the night air. Photographs and flowers rest on the stone, and children's voices whisper stories that seem too heavy for their age. At the center of every story is one name: Rex. But to understand why they light those candles year after year, you have to go back to the moment when silence almost swallowed an entire community. When the truth about what was happening within the walls of the school was nearly lost forever. And how one German shepherd, weathered from years of service, refused to let that silence win. This is not just a memorial to a dog. It is a reminder of bravery, of loyalty, of the unspoken bond that sometimes sees what we cannot. Tonight, as the flames burn softly, you'll hear the story of how Rex became more than a companion, more than a guardian. He became a symbol of trust, of protection, and of love that cannot be silenced. The town of Belluno nestled quietly at the foot of the Dolomites, its cobblestone streets lined with bakeries that smelled of warm bread each morning, and churches whose bells kept steady time for generations. In such a place, trust was not just given, it was inherited. Families trusted their neighbors, trusted their parish priests, trusted the men and women who stood at the front of classrooms teaching their children. And at the center of this circle of faith stood Giovanni Marchetti, the literature teacher at Santa Lucia School. To most, Giovanni was everything a parent could hope for in an educator. He was elegant in dress, his pressed jackets always matched with polished shoes, his hair slicked back with precision, his voice measured like a man accustomed to being listened to. Parents often said he had a gift. The way he recited Dante in the classroom could make even restless children sit still, their small faces tilted upward, drawn into worlds they could not yet fully understand. At parent-teacher evenings, mothers and fathers praised him openly. "Giovanni has unlocked a side of my son I never knew existed," one mother declared, dabbing her eyes with a tissue as she explained how her quiet boy had begun writing poetry. "My daughter never loved reading before. Now she spends hours copying passages he recommended." Giovanni accepted such compliments with a practiced humility. He would tilt his head modestly, place a hand over his chest, and say, "It is your children's light, not mine. I only hold up the mirror so they may see themselves more clearly." His words felt rehearsed, but in the warmth of the school hall, beneath the glow of fluorescent lights, no one seemed to mind. The applause that followed was genuine. And yet, beneath that applause, lived shadows. One evening, after such a meeting, a father lingered longer than the rest. He noticed something in Giovanni's manner, the way the teacher's eyes held on to his daughter's just a second too long, the way Giovanni rested his hand gently on her shoulder as he spoke about her talents. It was subtle, the kind of gesture that could easily be excused as kindness. Still, the father felt an unease crawl through his stomach. But he said nothing. After all, who would dare cast suspicion on the town's most respected teacher? Inside the classroom itself, Giovanni's command was absolute. His students sat in neat rows, their desks worn smooth by years of restless hands, while Giovanni's voice rose and fell like a conductor guiding an unseen orchestra. He quoted Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch as if they were dear friends. His chalk notes on the board, looping, graceful script, became treasures the children copied dutifully into their notebooks. He cultivated an atmosphere of reverence. If a child misbehaved, Giovanni never raised his voice, Instead, he used silence. Long, uncomfortable silences that pressed down like a weight until the offender squirmed and apologized. Parents adored this method. They said it taught respect without cruelty. They did not see how some children shrank under that silence, their small bodies stiffening whenever his eyes fell on them. Giovanni had a way of making each parent feel their child was special. He remembered details others would have forgotten. The story a boy wrote about his grandfather, the exact shade of ribbon a girl wore in her hair. He repeated these details at school meetings, weaving them into compliments that left parents glowing. "It's rare," they whispered among themselves, "to find a teacher who sees each child so individually." But not all whispers were approving. At the local cafe, where men played cards and women traded gossip, murmurs sometimes rose about how much time Giovanni spent alone with certain students. "It's only tutoring," someone would insist, waving away the concern. "Better to have a teacher so invested than one who doesn't care." And yet, the seeds of doubt were there, waiting. For now, however, the illusion remained unbroken. Parents shook Giovanni's hand with gratitude. Children carried his praise like medals. And the principal of Santa Lucia often said with pride, "Giovanni Marchetti is the jewel of this school." In the evenings, as the last bell echoed across the courtyard, and children rushed into the arms of waiting parents, Giovanni often lingered at his desk, his long fingers brushing dust from books stacked high. From the hallway, teachers passing by would see him smile faintly at the pages of Dante, as though confiding secrets with the poet himself. They thought it endearing. No one wondered why his classroom light burned longer than all the rest. The truth of who Giovanni was, and what he carried beneath his polished surface, remained hidden in those quiet after-hours. Hidden in the way shadows clung to the corners of the room when everyone else had gone. That night, the father who had felt unease tried to dismiss it. He sat at the dinner table, watching his daughter chatter about school, her laughter bright and careless. Maybe he was imagining things, he told himself. Giovanni had helped so many children blossom. Surely he was overthinking. And so he swallowed his doubts, convincing himself that trust was safer than suspicion. It would not be the last time someone in Belluno made that choice. The first disappearance barely stirred the town at all. Children ran away sometimes, especially teenagers testing the edges of freedom. When Elena Rossi, 15 years old, failed to return home one spring evening, the police assured her frantic mother it was likely a phase. Perhaps she had quarreled with her parents. Perhaps she was hiding at a friend's house. They promised she would turn up. Her mother, Anna, did not sleep that night. She sat by the phone with Eleanor's favorite jacket draped over her lap, staring at the front door as if willing it to open. The clock ticked past midnight, then past dawn. No footsteps, no voice calling, "Mama." Only silence. Days passed. Posters went up, Eleanor's soft features staring out from every lamppost. Her classmates whispered in hallways. Teachers held moments of silence. But within weeks, the town began to move on. Denial is a shield communities often cling to. The police insisted Elena had chosen to leave. Anna knew better. Elena's toothbrush was still by the sink, her diary still on the nightstand. She would never have left without them. Summer came, and with it, another blow. Marco Bianchi, 14, vanished after football practice. His father, Pietro, was the kind of man who worked with his hands, a mason, tough as the stone he carved. Yet the night Marco failed to return home, Pietro's strength crumbled. He walked the streets until sunrise, calling his son's name into the empty air. His wife followed behind him, clutching Marco's cleats like they were holy relics. The police repeated the same lines. Teenage boys are restless. He might have run away to the city. Boys are resilient. But Pietro knew his son. Marco dreamed of playing for Italy's national team one day. He had posters of Roberto Baggio plastered across his wall. He was not a boy who would simply vanish without a word. Pietro hammered Marco's photo onto every bulletin board he could find. He stood in the town square, begging for help, his voice breaking. Some listened. Others turned away. People whispered, "Perhaps there was trouble at home." It was easier to believe in domestic problems than to admit something darker might be happening among them. By autumn, the town was split between memory and fear. Children walked to school in pairs, parents clutched their hands tighter. And still, the unthinkable continued. Sofia Romano, 12 years old, disappeared on her way back from choir practice. Her school bag was found leaning against the stone wall near the church, as though she had simply set it down for a moment. Her father, a local grocer, collapsed when the police brought it to him. Her mother's wails echoed through the night, spilling out of their apartment above the shop, carrying across the narrow streets until even strangers wept to hear it. 3 children, 3 families broken. The town reeled. For the first time, people began to whisper connections. All 3 children attended Santa Lucia School. All 3 had been students of Giovanni Marchetti. Still, such whispers were pushed aside. He was, after all, their jewel, their pride. How could they possibly believe he had anything to do with this? The mayor held a press conference on the steps of City Hall. He spoke of unity, of patience, of faith in the authorities. Cameras flashed. Parents clutched each other. Yet behind the polished words was unease. Eyes scanning the crowd, hearts asking silent questions they dared not speak aloud. At home, the nights grew longer. Phones rang endlessly in police stations, mothers calling for updates, fathers demanding answers. Officers repeated the same rehearsed phrases. "We're doing everything we can. Please try to stay calm." But calm was impossible. Anna Rossi, mother of Elena, began leaving candles in her daughter's bedroom window each night, hoping the glow might guide her home. Pietro Bianchi stopped working altogether, wandering fields and back roads, convinced his son might still be waiting somewhere. Sofia's parents taped her photograph to their shop window, so every passerby would see her smile and remember she was still missing. The community's grief grew heavier, but so did its denial. Parents told their children not to worry, to focus on school, to believe in the goodness of the world. They wanted to protect their innocence, even as their own faith eroded. And in the midst of it all, Giovanni Marchetti remained untouched. At staff meetings, he expressed his sorrow with eloquent words. He shook parents' hands, bowed his head, said prayers for the missing children. People thanked him for his compassion. They told themselves that no man so articulate, so devoted, could possibly harbor darkness. Still, there were moments, fleeting, nearly invisible, when shadows slipped through the cracks. A mother once caught Giovanni watching her daughter a moment too long during recess. A teacher passing by his classroom late at night wondered why he was always there alone, long after everyone had left. Each time, they dismissed the unease. Fear was easier to silence than confront. 3 names now haunted the town: Elena, Marco, Sofia. 3 sets of parents waking each morning to beds still made, chairs still empty. Their cries turned into prayers, their prayers into silence, and silence into something more dangerous: resignation. For Belluno, Denial was the only way to keep breathing. But beneath it, the foundations of trust were already cracking, preparing to give way. The first whispers began in the most ordinary of places, at the bakery on Via Roma, while mothers waited in line for bread still warm from the oven. One leaned toward another, lowering her voice, as though even the flour-dusted shelves might overhear. "Have you noticed?" she asked. Elena, Marco, Sophia, all of them were in the same class. Giovanni's class. The other woman frowned, then shook her head too quickly, as if to banish the thought. "Don't be ridiculous. Giovanni, he's devoted to those children. He's the only one who cares enough to stay after hours. Don't you remember how he organized that summer play last year? Without him, our children would have nothing. But seeds of suspicion, once planted, rarely die. They linger, growing roots in silence." By evening, the same question was repeated at the butcher's, at the church steps, in the hushed corners of cafes, where old men stirred sugar into their espressos with trembling hands. What if? And yet, each whisper was swiftly smothered. The principal of Santa Lucia, a heavy-set man named Signor Bellini, convened a meeting after the third disappearance. His voice echoed through the school gymnasium, meant to sound reassuring, but instead carrying a defensive edge. "We must not succumb to hysteria. These tragedies are terrible, yes, but to suggest Signor Marchetti could be involved is absurd. He is one of our finest educators. The children adore him. The parents respect him. He is the last person who would harm a child." Applause followed, though scattered, hesitant. Parents clung to the reassurance because they needed to. The alternative was unthinkable. To imagine the man who recited Dante with such elegance could harbor darkness was to shatter the very trust the town was built on. Still, not everyone was convinced. Pietro Bianchi, Marco's father, stood at the back of the meeting, fists clenched. His eyes burned with sleepless nights. "Then where is my son?" he demanded, his voice ragged. "Where are they all?" A heavy silence followed. Bellini cleared his throat, shifted uncomfortably, and muttered about patience, about ongoing investigations. But no answer came. Pietro's voice broke the illusion, if only for a moment. Later, in the streets, parents avoided his gaze. To side with him meant to admit suspicion. To admit suspicion meant to face a nightmare. Most chose denial. Giovanni himself seemed almost untouchable. He walked through the corridors with the same measured grace, offering condolences to grieving families, bowing his head in church pews. He spoke with eloquence about the fragility of youth, about the importance of hope. Mothers wept at his words, convinced he shared their pain. But there were others who noticed more. A teacher, Signora Leone, recalled walking past Giovanni's classroom late one evening. The light glowed under the door, though all students had long gone. Inside, she glimpsed Giovanni at his desk, papers neatly stacked, his face unreadable as he stared at nothing. She told herself it was only dedication. She never spoke of it aloud. The children whispered too, in voices even softer than their parents. They said Giovanni's eyes sometimes lingered too long, that he asked certain students to stay behind after class more often than others. But when asked directly, they shook their heads and denied it. Who would believe them when every adult insisted Giovanni was a saint? Rumors spread like cracks in glass, delicate at first, then impossible to ignore. Some families pulled their children from Santa Lucia altogether. Others doubled down, insisting their faith in Giovanni was stronger than gossip. The town began to divide, suspicion on one side, trust on the other. And in that divide, grief festered. Anna Rossi, Eleanor's mother, avoided the grocery store because she could no longer bear the stares. Some pitied her, others silently accused her of negligence. Pietro drank more, his anger spilling into shouts in the square. Sophia's parents clung to the defense of Giovanni, insisting he was as much a victim of rumor as they were of tragedy. If we lose faith in him, they said, we lose faith in all goodness. The local newspaper ran cautious headlines. Where are our children? And community must remain strong. But between the lines, the unease was unmistakable. Everyone knew the pattern. Everyone refused to name it. At Sunday Mass, Father Carlo addressed the congregation with trembling hands. We must not allow suspicion to poison us. These are times of trial, yes, but we must cling to faith. Remember, evil thrives where trust is broken. His words, meant to heal, only deepened the fracture. Was clinging to trust an act of faith or blindness? One night, in the shadows of the town square, two mothers argued. You think I don't see it, one hissed. The way he touches their shoulders, the way he looks at them. Don't tell me you haven't noticed. The other shook her head fiercely. No. Stop it. Giovanni is the only one holding this school together. Without him, we'd have nothing. He's not the monster you're searching for. Their voices rose, sharp enough to draw stares from passers-by. Shame silenced them. They walked away in opposite directions, neither convinced, both unsettled. Through it all, Giovanni's reputation shielded him. His composure never cracked. At the next parent meeting, he stood before them in his polished jacket, speaking of resilience, of the power of literature to heal wounds. He quoted Dante once more, his voice smooth as silk. Through me you pass into the city of woe. Through me you pass among the lost people. Some parents wept at the beauty of his recital, never noticing the flicker in his eyes. Others felt their stomachs twist, but said nothing. To speak out would be to shatter the illusion, and illusions are often easier to protect than truths. So the whispers continued, low and dangerous, weaving through Belluno's narrow streets like smoke that could neither be seen fully nor put out. The stage was set. A town divided, parents clinging to hope, a teacher bathed in trust, and beneath it all, a silence that grew heavier with each passing day. No one yet dared to admit it, but the ground beneath Santa Lucia School was already beginning to crack. By winter, Belluno no longer carried the warmth it once had. The streets were the same, cobbled and narrow, lined with faded shutters and potted geraniums, but the air carried something heavier, something that made neighbors cross the street to avoid each other's eyes. Trust, once as common as the sound of church bells, had thinned into suspicion. The fractures showed most clearly at the town meetings, called more frequently now in the municipal hall. Rows of wooden chairs filled with exhausted faces, fathers with unshaven jaws, mothers gripping photographs of their missing children, grandparents holding rosaries as though prayer might coax answers from the silence. At the front, the chief of police, a weary man named Commissario D'Amato, repeated the same promises each time. We are doing everything we can. Patrols have doubled. Investigations continue. Please, remain calm. His voice was steady, but the dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed the strain. It wasn't enough. Anna Rossi stood from her chair, her daughter Elena's face staring out from the poster she held. Her voice trembled, but it carried through the hall. You tell us to be calm, but my daughter has been gone for 7 months. Calm does not bring her home. The room stirred. Pietro Bianchi leapt to his feet, slamming his fist against the back of the chair in front of him. Enough excuses. You search the forests, the rivers, the abandoned factories, but you refuse to look where the answers truly are. His gaze swept toward the cluster of teachers seated at the side, and though he never spoke Giovanni's name, everyone understood. The tension cracked like thunder. Parents argued openly now, voices rising and colliding in the hall. Some demanded that every teacher be questioned, their homes searched. Others shouted back in defense of Giovanni, insisting that to accuse him was to insult the very soul of the school. The principal, Signor Bellini, waddled to the front, his cheeks flushed with indignation. "I will not tolerate this slander," he declared, pounding his palm on the podium. "Signor Marchetti has given decades of his life to this community. He is a man of integrity, a man of learning. To even whisper his name in connection with these tragedies is shameful." But his words only deepened the divide. Parents who had once sat side by side in church pews now glared at each other across the hall. One mother wept loudly, sobbing that she no longer allowed her son to walk to school alone. Another shouted that paranoia was poisoning the town, that the children needed stability, not suspicion. Outside the meetings, the arguments spilled into everyday life. Cafes buzzed with rumors, espresso cups rattling against saucers as voices dropped to conspiratorial tones. The barista at Cafe Venezia heard the same words each morning. It must be someone close, someone they trust. Patrons leaned in, eyes darting toward the street, always careful, never speaking Giovanni's name too loudly. At the butcher's, an old man muttered that he'd seen Giovanni walking late at night near the square, his coat collar turned high. At the hairdresser's, a young mother whispered that her daughter had come home pale after staying late in Giovanni's class. Nothing was proven. Everything was repeated. The rumors swirled like smoke, clinging to every corner of Belluno until no one could breathe without inhaling it. And the children, those still safe at home, felt the weight of it most. They walked in pairs now, clutching each other's hands as they moved down the narrow streets. Parents hovered outside school gates, refusing to leave until their child was safely inside. Gone were the days when children chased soccer balls freely through the piazza or skipped home from choir practice. Fear stalked their footsteps. At night, shutters closed earlier. Curtains were drawn tighter. Families huddled inside with their doors locked, even though they told themselves their town was still safe. Safety, once a given, had become a fragile story they recited to their children like a bedtime prayer. Still, some clung fiercely to denial. "Not Giovanni," insisted Sophia's mother at the grocer's, her eyes blazing as someone dared to hint otherwise. "He wept for our daughter. He came to our house, brought flowers, prayed with us. How can you accuse such a man?" Across the counter, Pietro spat the words like venom. "Because while he weeps with you, our children vanish." The argument silenced the store. Shoppers lowered their heads, torn between pity and unease, unwilling to choose a side aloud. It was as if Belluno itself had split down the middle. One half clinging to the belief that their beloved teacher was incapable of harm. The other half whispering that the answer had been in front of them all along. But no matter which side they stood on, grief was universal. The empty chairs at dinner tables, the unanswered phones, the beds still made. These reminders united them in sorrow, even as suspicion drove them apart. And over it all hung Giovanni Marchetti, untouched by the storm. He continued teaching, his voice steady, his lessons polished. He attended every meeting, every vigil, every prayer service, speaking of resilience and unity. Some applauded him louder than ever, as though their faith in him could erase the gnawing doubt. Others watched him in silence, their hearts whispering questions their lips dared not form. The fractures in Belluno were no longer invisible. They stretched across homes, across friendships, across the very foundation of trust. The town was breaking, and beneath the cracks lay something no one was yet ready to face. Snow still clung stubbornly to the edges of Belluno's rooftops when the police vans rolled into the square one grey morning. Their arrival drew stares from shopkeepers, opening shutters, and children hurrying to school. Most days, the presence of law enforcement was limited to the local patrol car. But this convoy felt different, heavier, as though the town itself was bracing for something unseen. At the center of it all stepped Detective Lucia Ferraro. She was not tall, but she carried herself with a kind of quiet command that made people instinctively clear her path. Her coat was worn but tailored, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes sharp and restless, scanning every corner of the square as if cataloguing it in a language only she understood. But it was not Lucia who first drew whispers. It was the figure moving at her side. A German shepherd, black and tan with a proud stance, and eyes that seemed to cut straight through the morning fog. His name was Rex, and though he walked without a sound, the air shifted around him. Children clutched their mothers' coats tighter. Old men paused in their conversations mid-sentence. Even the pigeons scattering across the square seemed to give him space. Lucia's hand rested lightly on the leash, though it was clear she did not need it. Rex moved with her, not behind or ahead, but in tandem, a rhythm long practiced, born from trust, earned in the fire of rescues and searches that most people only read about in headlines. At the town hall, parents packed into the meeting room once more, their grief fermenting into impatience. Murmurs rippled when Lucia entered with Rex at her side. A dog, some scoffed. After months of unanswered questions, this was what the authorities offered them. The commissario introduced her. Detective Ferraro has been brought from Milan. She has worked with the canine unit for over a decade. She and her partner Rex have assisted in rescues across the country. Landslides in Liguria, earthquakes in Emilia, missing persons in the Alps. They are among the best we have. Still, doubt filled the room. One father muttered under his breath, "What can a dog do that men cannot?" Another added, louder, "We need answers, not animals sniffing at shadows." Lucia didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. She stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying. "I know what you are thinking. You want action. You want certainty. You have given months of faith, and you feel betrayed. I cannot promise you miracles, but I can promise you this. Rex listens where humans fail. He notices what eyes dismiss. He does not believe in illusions, and he does not lie. Sometimes, that is what it takes to find the truth." Her words silenced the room, not with comfort, but with the weight of a new possibility. Rex stood steady, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, unblinking. To some, it felt unnerving, as though the animal could see deeper than any man. To others, it was oddly reassuring. Children, who moments before had shrunk behind their parents, now leaned forward, fascinated by the calm strength in the dog's posture. When the meeting ended, the families filed out into the bitter air. Conversations sparked immediately in hushed tones. Some dismissed the idea outright. "A dog will not bring our children back." Others clung to it desperately. If men have failed, why not trust the creature who doesn't speak but understands? Lucia didn't linger to hear the debate. She crouched beside Rex in the square, her hand brushing through his fur. It was a gesture so subtle, so private, it almost seemed like prayer. She whispered something to him, words no one else could hear, and Rex's ears twitched, his body leaning slightly into her hand. The bond between them was quiet, but undeniable. As the sun set that evening, Lucia walked the corridors of Santa Lucia School for the first time. The building loomed cold and indifferent, its tiled floors echoing beneath her boots. Rex padded silently beside her, nose low, ears pricked. He sniffed the air with deliberate care, pausing at doorways, circling corners, his movements a language only Lucia could read. Teachers followed at a distance, whispering skepticism. One remarked that the dog would only distract from real police work. Another crossed himself, muttering that relying on animals in such matters was a sign of desperation. But a few remained silent, their eyes fixed on Rex, as if sensing there was something in his stillness they could not explain. Lucia watched him closely. Every shift of his shoulders, every sudden stillness, every flick of his ears carried meaning. To the untrained eye, Rex was merely walking. To Lucia, he was speaking. And though he had not yet barked, not yet pawed the ground, she saw the tension in his body, as though he already felt something hidden beneath the walls of this school. That night, as she stood outside the building, the town square eerily quiet, Lucia tightened her scarf against the wind. She looked down at Rex, who sat at her feet, eyes locked on the dark windows of the school. "Not yet," she murmured, her voice low, as though answering an unspoken question. "But we'll find them. You always do." Rex lifted his head slightly, ears pricking at the sound of her voice. In his gaze, there was no doubt, no hesitation, only focus. For the people of Belluno, skepticism still ruled. They whispered in cafes and in churches that night, asking each other what a dog could possibly accomplish. But for the first time in months, something unexplainable stirred in the air. Not trust, not relief, but a fragile thread of hope, carried on the silent steps of a German shepherd whose eyes never blinked away from the truth. The school stood silent under a pale moon, its stone walls casting long shadows across the courtyard. The usual clamor of children's voices was absent. Only the wind rustled through the empty playground, pushing a forgotten swing into a lonely creek. The building looked like what it had always been: ordinary, respectable, safe. But that night, under the weight of suspicion and grief, it seemed to breathe differently, as though it held secrets between its bricks. Detective Lucia Ferraro stood at the entrance with her flashlight in hand. The beams of her officers cut across the hallways, slicing into corners where dust had settled undisturbed. Behind her, Rex stepped forward, his paws soft on the tiles, his breath steady and measured. His presence filled the silence in a way no man's voice could. The janitor unlocked classroom doors one by one, muttering apologies for the inconvenience. Teachers trailed nervously, some crossing their arms, others biting their lips, bristling at the idea of their school being treated like a crime scene. And yet, each of them stole glances at the German shepherd, whose nose traced invisible lines across the air. Rex moved with precision, his head lowered, tail stiff, ears pricked at the faintest sound. He sniffed around the lockers, the stairwells, the edges of bulletin boards lined with cheerful drawings. At first his pace was calm, almost leisurely, but then something shifted. He paused in a hallway near Giovanni Marchetti's classroom, his body tensing. A low rumble built in his throat, not quite a growl, more like a warning. Lucia felt it before she heard it. She crouched beside him, her gloved hand brushing his neck. "What is it, ragazzo?" she whispered. Rex's nose pressed to the floor, then to the wall, back and forth with restless urgency. He began to pace in short, tight circles, as if trying to trap a scent that slipped just beyond reach. The officers exchanged uneasy looks. One muttered, "Probably a rat's nest." Another smirked, "Dogs find ghosts where there are none." But Lucia's expression did not waver. She knew this agitation. Rex wasn't wrong. He was restless because something didn't fit, something that didn't belong. His instincts had pulled them out of collapsed buildings before survivors suffocated. His nose had led them to missing hikers buried under snow. He did not fidget without reason. "Keep the light steady," she ordered. Her voice cut through the murmurs. She followed Rex as he pressed against the wall, his claws clicking lightly against the tiles. He sniffed near the baseboards, then jerked back, whining softly, pacing again. For a long moment, the group simply watched. The silence grew heavy, interrupted only by Rex's breathing and the faint hum of the old radiators. Then the janitor cleared his throat nervously. "Signora Detective, this is Marchetti's classroom. He always stays late grading here. If you wish, I can—" "No," Lucia interrupted gently, but firmly. "We're done for tonight." Her officers frowned. "Done? But he hasn't found anything conclusive." Lucia stood, resting her hand on Rex's head to calm him. His body still hummed with tension, his gaze fixed on the corner of the classroom wall as though it were more alive than the people around him. "He found enough," she said quietly. The teachers shifted uneasily. Some scoffed, others looked away, but the seed was planted. The image of that dog, unblinking, pawing at the floor as though something beneath it breathed, would not leave them. As the sweep concluded, Lucia led Rex outside into the cold air. Frost had begun to form along the windows. The town was asleep, unaware of the restless animal who had stirred the stillness inside their school. She crouched again, her breath clouding in the night. "You feel it, don't you?" she murmured. Rex licked the air, then looked back toward the building, ears erect, gaze unwavering. To any passerby, it was only a dog staring at stone. But to Lucia, it was a warning, sharp and undeniable. She had seen this before. The unease before truth revealed itself, the scratching at the edges of silence where lies were buried. That night, the townspeople continued their debates in cafes and kitchens, still caught between suspicion and trust. They did not know that inside their school, a German shepherd had already begun tearing at the veil, restless against secrets no one yet dared to name. It was not proof, not yet, but it was the first breath of something hidden, and it would not stay hidden forever. The second search of Santa Lucia School began under a sky bruised with clouds, the moon smothered in a haze that seemed to mirror the heaviness in Belluno's air. Weeks had passed since Rex's first sweep, weeks of whispers that gnawed at the edges of the community's composure. Nothing had been proven, nothing had been found. Yet the image of that German shepherd, restless at Giovanni's classroom wall, lingered like a splinter in everyone's mind. Lucia entered the school just after dusk, her breath misting in the cold corridor. The building was unnervingly quiet, its rows of desks and faded posters stripped of the laughter they once held. She let her flashlight sweep the hall, then gave a single nod. The officers spread out, their boots echoing against tile. Behind her, Rex moved forward, muscles taut, his nose grazing the air as though searching for a thread only he could sense. From the moment they reached Giovanni's classroom, Rex's demeanor changed. His tail stiffened, his ears pinned forward, and a low vibration rumbled from his chest. Lucia froze, recognizing it instantly, the sound of certainty. "Easy, ragazzo," she murmured, loosening the leash just enough. But Rex was already pulling toward the corner where the chalkboard met the floor. He lowered his head, sniffed, then pressed his paw hard against the wood. His claws scraped once, twice. Then he began to dig. The sound was raw, jarring in the silent room. Wood splintered under the force of his scratching. Officers shifted uneasily, exchanging looks. One whispered, "What the hell is he doing?" Rex didn't stop. He clawed with relentless determination, his body trembling with effort. The noise grew harsher, his nails scraping so violently that chips of wood scattered across the floor. Within minutes, blood welled at the tips of his paws, but still he kept going, his breath heavy, his eyes wild with focus. "Ferraro," one officer said nervously. "Call him off. He's going to hurt himself." Lucia crouched beside Rex, her hand hovering near his shoulder, but not pulling him back. She had seen this before, on a mountain slope where a child had been buried under snow, in a collapsed building where survivors clung to the last threads of air. Rex only pushed himself to this point when the truth was close. "He knows something's here," she said firmly. Her voice was calm, but her eyes never left the trembling muscles of her partner. "Let him work." The principal, Bellini, who had insisted on being present, wrung his hands nervously. "This is absurd," he snapped. "He's scratching at the floor like an animal chasing vermin. That's all this is. A rat's nest." "Nothing more." But his voice cracked on the last word, betraying fear. Rex snarled now, the sound low and guttural, unlike anything the officers had heard from him before. He tore at the floorboards with a desperation that unsettled even the most hardened among them. Each scrape seemed to dig deeper into the town's fragile illusion, shredding the idea that Santa Lucia was a place of safety. Finally, Rex let out a sharp bark, startling everyone. He struck the floor again and again until his claws split, tiny cracks forming in the polished wood. Blood smeared against the boards. He didn't whine. He didn't pause. He refused to leave. Lucia pressed a steadying hand against his neck, feeling the tremor of his determination. Her voice was soft, reverent almost. "You feel it, don't you, amico? You won't stop until they see." One officer swallowed hard, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "If a dog is willing to bleed for something—" He trailed off, glancing at the others, as though afraid to finish the thought. The room seemed to shrink. The air thickened. Every creak of Rex's nails against wood was like a clock counting down to revelation. At last, Lucia stood and faced the officers. "Mark this spot. Tomorrow we bring tools." The principal erupted. "This is madness. You can't tear apart a classroom on the whim of a dog. Do you understand what this would mean for our school, for our reputation?" Lucia's gaze was cold steel. "Your reputation means nothing if your walls hide the truth." Silence followed. The officers avoided Bellini's eyes. Their hands fidgeted at their belts, their boots scuffed nervously against the floor, but none spoke against her. The image of Rex, his paws bloodied yet unyielding, had burned itself into their minds. When the search ended, Rex still resisted leaving. He sat stubbornly by the corner, panting heavily, his chest rising and falling in ragged rhythm. His claws tapped softly against the boards, not with the fury of before, but with the persistence of a guardian unwilling to surrender his watch. Lucia knelt, pressing her forehead gently to his, whispering so only he could hear. We'll be back. I promise. As the officers packed their equipment, and the principal stormed out muttering about lawsuits and hysteria, one truth lingered in the stale classroom air. The dog had seen what they refused to see. And for the first time, the question was no longer, what if? But, what now? Morning light poured through the stained glass of Santa Lucia School, softening the hard edges of its corridors. But the brightness did little to wash away the memory of the night before, of Rex tearing at the corner of Giovanni's classroom until his paws bled. The story spread quickly, carried on hushed voices from one household to the next. By dawn, the entire town was buzzing with the tale of a dog who refused to leave a single spot on the floor. In the teacher's lounge, the principal, Signor Bellini, slammed his palm on the table, rattling coffee cups. His face glowed red, his mustache twitching as he barked out his frustration. This is ridiculous. I will not allow our school to be humiliated because of an animal's madness. Dogs scratch. That is what they do. Perhaps there's a rat beneath the boards, or dampness rotting the wood. That's all. Across the table, teachers shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded, eager to side with authority, to protect what little sense of normalcy they had left. Others lowered their eyes, remembering Rex's unrelenting fury, the way his blood stained the wood. It was then that Giovanni Marchetti entered, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. He carried himself with his usual calm, his jacket pressed, his hair immaculate. To anyone who didn't know better, he looked like the very picture of composure. I hear our guest from Milan had quite a spectacle last night, Giovanni said smoothly, his lips curving in a faint smile. What was it this time? A ghost? A rat? Perhaps Signor Ferraro's beast has grown bored and wishes to give us all a show. His words carried through the room like oil on water, slick and difficult to grasp. A few teachers chuckled nervously, grateful for the levity. Others glanced at each other, troubled by his dismissive tone. Bellini seized on Giovanni's remark like a lifeline. Exactly. This hysteria must stop. We cannot allow outsiders, especially dogs, to dictate how we run our school. Do you understand what this looks like to the town? A mutt scratching at our floors as though there are bodies buried beneath. It is shameful. But the words "bodies buried" hung in the air like a curse. No one spoke for a long moment. When Detective Lucia Ferraro entered, silence fell. She walked past them all with a steady step, her eyes cutting briefly to Giovanni. He smiled faintly, but she did not return it. Behind her came Rex, his paws wrapped in bandages, yet his stance unbroken. His gaze went immediately to the corner of the classroom down the hall, as though the night before had never ended. Lucia folded her arms. Rex doesn't bleed without reason. Her voice was low but sharp, slicing through Bellini's bluster. He is not a pet chasing rats. He is a trained rescuer who has found lives buried beneath rubble when men declared them lost. If he says something is here, then something is here. Giovanni gave a soft laugh, shaking his head as if humoring a child. With respect, Detective, your faith in animals is admirable. But we are men of reason here. If we let a beast dictate our actions, what does that say about us? Lucia stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. It says, we are willing to listen to the only creature in this room who does not lie. A murmur rippled among the teachers. Bellini sputtered, tugging at his collar. Enough of this nonsense. I will not have this institution destroyed by superstition. Until you bring hard evidence, Detective, I forbid you from tearing apart our classrooms. The board will hear of this. Lucia didn't answer. She simply crouched beside Rex, her hand brushing the bandages on his paw. The German shepherd pressed closer to the floor, nose hovering over the same corner, his body trembling with restrained urgency. The tension was unbearable. Teachers shifted. Parents, arriving early to collect their children, peeked nervously through the windows, catching only fragments of raised voices and the unmistakable silhouette of the dog, fixated still on the floor. The clash had become more than evidence versus denial. It was instinct against illusion, truth clawing at walls built of pride and fear. Finally, one teacher spoke, Signora Leone, her voice hesitant. But what if he's right? What if the dog knows something we don't? Bellini snapped his head toward her, eyes flashing. Do not indulge this hysteria. There is no what if. There is only the fact that this school must remain respectable. Do you want to see it destroyed by rumors, by paranoia? Giovanni's voice followed, smoother, more dangerous. We have already lost too much. Do not let fear consume us further. Children need stability, not chaos. But beneath his calm words, there was an undercurrent, a tremor that made even the doubters uneasy. He was too composed, too eager to wave away suspicion. Lucia saw it. Rex felt it. And though Belluno's leaders dismissed the scratching as meaningless, the truth was no longer safely buried. Because once a dog refuses to leave, the silence has already begun to crack. The decision came not with a shout, but with a whisper of resolve. Detective Lucia Ferraro stood in Giovanni Marchetti's classroom, the late afternoon light spilling through the high windows in fractured beams. Around her, teachers murmured. The principal huffed with indignation, and Giovanni himself leaned casually against his desk, arms folded as though amused by the spectacle. But Rex was no longer a spectacle. He was in command. The German shepherd crouched low at the corner of the classroom, his body taut as a drawn bowstring, his bandaged paws pressed hard against the wood, his nose buried against the floorboards, his breaths sharp and desperate. He whined, a sound so raw that it cut through the noise of men's voices like a blade. Lucia lowered herself beside him, her eyes never leaving his trembling frame. She had seen him like this before, on the slopes of the Alps, when he refused to abandon a patch of snow until his claws unearthed a faint human cry. In the ruins of Amatrice, where his insistence had saved a child no one believed could still be alive. This was not a chance. This was instinct, sharpened into certainty. Lucia rose, her voice firm, leaving no room for hesitation. Tear up the floor. The room erupted. Bellini's face blanched, then flushed a furious red. You cannot. This is absurd. You have no warrant, no evidence beyond an animal's scratching. You'll destroy our school, our reputation. Giovanni's smooth baritone followed, deceptively calm. Detective, with all respect, to indulge this hysteria is to shame our profession. Surely you see that. His eyes glittered as he tilted his head, almost daring her to stand her ground. Lucia didn't flinch. She turned to her officers. Axes. Crowbars. Now. The silence that followed was heavy, trembling. The officers hesitated, caught between the principal's outrage and their commander's authority. But then one stepped forward, jaw tight, and retrieved the tools. The others followed, the scrape of metal against tile echoing in the classroom like a promise. Bellini shouted, "This is vandalism. I will report you to the superintendent." Lucia's reply was steady, cold. "Report me if you wish. But first, look your townspeople in the eye and tell them you silenced the only voice that refuses to lie." She gestured toward Rex, whose growl vibrated low and insistent. The first swing of the axe struck the floor. Wood splintered with a crack so loud it made teachers flinch. The sound reverberated through the walls, a sound Belluno had not heard before. The sound of denial being torn apart. Another blow, then another. Planks split. Dust rose in clouds. Nails shrieked as they wrenched free from beams. The officers worked in rhythm, sweat gathering at their brows, while Rex barked, sharp and urgent, each cry pushing them on. Giovanni's composure faltered. His arms unfolded, his jaw clenched. He muttered something under his breath, too low to catch, and for the first time, unease flickered in his eyes. At last, a hollow thud answered the strikes. Wood giving way to emptiness. The officers exchanged a look. They pried harder until a section of flooring collapsed entirely, revealing blackness below. A draft of air escaped, stale and damp, carrying with it the faint scent of mold and something heavier. The weight of confinement. Flashlights were switched on, beams stabbing into the darkness, cutting through dust that swirled like ghosts disturbed. A passage yawned open beneath the classroom. Narrow, steep, its walls lined with stone. The room fell silent. No one spoke. Even Bellini, whose fury had filled every corner moments earlier, stood frozen, his mouth parted, but no sound escaping. Lucia stepped forward, her hand brushing Rex's head in silent acknowledgement. Then she looked to her officers. "We go down." They descended one by one, boots thudding against the hidden stairs. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against their lungs. The beams of their flashlights caught damp stone, rusted pipes, and walls scratched faintly by what looked like fingernails. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the echo of their breaths. Above them, Giovanni remained by his desk, his fingers curling so tightly against the wood that his knuckles whitened. His polished demeanor could not mask the sweat gathering at his temple. Down below, the officers reached the bottom. The narrow passage opened into a low chamber. The smell was stronger here. Not rot, but the sour stench of fear long trapped. The beams of their flashlights swung across the room, landing on objects that made stomachs clench. An old mattress, stained, food wrappers scattered, ropes frayed at the ends. One officer gagged quietly. Another whispered, "My God." Lucia's light swept across the chamber, steady, relentless. Her jaw tightened as she saw it. Undeniable proof that the walls of Belluno's trust had been built on a lie. Rex barked from above, sharp and echoing down the stairwell, as if demanding they not look away. The truth was no longer hidden, and in the silence that followed, the illusion of safety finally shattered. The chamber breathed like an open wound. Flashlights cut through layers of dust and stone, beams jittering over damp walls. At first, there was only a shadow. Then, in the far corner, 3 small figures appeared, knees to their chests, arms wrapped tight, faces pale with hunger, but alive. It was Rex who moved first. The German shepherd descended the stairs, paws steady on the wet floor, his breath filling the silence. He lowered himself as he neared the children, ears tilted back, head bowed low. When his nose brushed Elena's trembling hand, she gasped, then clutched him as though drowning. Marco and Sophia followed, burying their faces in his fur. For months, they had prayed into silence. Now their answer was warm, breathing, steady. The officers froze, tears rising despite years of hardened duty. Lucia came last, her flashlight steadying as she knelt beside them. "Sei al sicuro adesso," she whispered. "You are safe now." The words settled like a blanket. Parents and townspeople pressed upstairs, but in the chamber, time stood still. One officer draped his coat around Marco. Another offered water to Sophia. Yet it was Rex who remained their anchor. Each time panic rose, he pressed closer, quieting their sobs into hiccups. Lucia scanned the chamber. Ropes, a filthy mattress, remnants of cold meals. Her jaw tightened. Giovanni's denial was over. She raised her voice. "We found them. Alive." Chaos erupted above as parents surged forward. But here, the space felt sacred. The children clung to Rex as if to salvation, their arms tangled around him like roots in a storm. When an officer tried to lift Marco, the boy fought, clutching Rex's fur. "Don't take me from him," he rasped. The words pierced every heart. Lucia crouched low, resting a hand on Rex's back. "He isn't leaving," she promised. "Where you go, he goes. Sempre. Always." Rex pressed deeper into their embrace, his body a vow. One by one, the children were lifted, frail, too light, their clothes heavy with neglect. Sophia whispered, "Don't leave us." Before anyone could answer, Rex nuzzled her hand, licking her knuckles. She sobbed in relief, clinging to him even as the officers carried her. It wasn't the men in uniform she trusted. It was the dog. Guided by Rex's steady presence, Eleanor allowed herself to be led. Marco resisted until Rex brushed against his leg. Only then did he relent, though his eyes never left the shepherd. Lucia's voice stayed firm. "Keep Rex beside them. Step carefully. No sudden movements. They need him." And so they rose from the darkness, children broken but breathing, carried not just by officers, but by the silent guardian who had refused to leave them behind. And so it was that the German shepherd led the way up the narrow stairs. Flashlights shook as beams bounced against the walls, catching glimpses of tiny handprints scratched into stone. Every step upward felt monumental, as though they were climbing out of hell itself. The closer they came to the surface, the louder the sounds above grew. Parents sobbing, teachers murmuring, the shuffle of townspeople crowding at the classroom door, waiting for proof of what they feared and prayed for in equal measure. Halfway up the stairs, Marco's voice broke the silence again. His words were fragile, but clear enough for all to hear. "Don't leave us." Rex pressed his head against the boy's arm, steadying him. His tail, usually proud and alert, brushed lightly against Marco's leg. A silent vow. Lucia whispered, as if to etch the words into the very stone around them. "He won't. I promise you, he won't." When at last they emerged into the fractured remains of Giovanni's classroom, the light hit the children like fire. They squinted, flinched, clutched at Rex to shield themselves. Gasps erupted from the crowd at the doorway, mothers collapsing, fathers choking on sobs, neighbors pressing hands to their mouths. The sight was too much to bear. 3 children, alive, and in the center of it all, Rex stood, his fur streaked with dust and blood, his eyes steady, his body the bridge between nightmare and salvation. No one looked at the officers. No one looked at Lucia. All eyes were on the shepherd, the one who had refused to stop scratching, the one who had bled to find them, the one the children still clung to as though letting go meant returning to the dark. The rescue was not loud. It was not triumphant. It was fragile, trembling, and holy, because at that moment, everyone in Belluno understood. Survival had a shape, and it wore the silhouette of a German shepherd, framed against the light. The wooden steps groaned under the weight of salvation. One by one, the officers carried the children up from the hidden passage, their frail bodies bundled in coats that swallowed them whole. The classroom, once a place of learning, now felt like a stage where truth had been forced into the open. Dust clung to the children's skin, and the stale odor of confinement seeped into the room, settling over the crowd like a ghost. The townspeople pressed against the doorframe, their faces pale, eyes wide. Then, the first child appeared. Eleanor, her limbs trembling, her cheeks streaked with grime and tears. A gasp erupted, sharp and collective, as though the entire room had been holding its breath for months, and had only now exhaled. Anna Rossi, who had spent 7 endless months searching, fell to her knees with a cry that tore through the air. Elena! Her voice cracked like a bell rung too hard. She tried to push through the crowd, but officers held her back gently, warning her to wait until the children were stable. She fought them, sobbing, her arms outstretched toward the girl who blinked against the light like a newborn. Behind her came Marco, carried carefully by 2 officers. His head rested limply against one man's shoulder until Rex appeared beside him, pushing his way through the crowd. The boy stirred, his thin hand reaching blindly until it found fur. The moment his fingers tangled into the shepherd's coat, his eyes opened, weak, glassy, but alive. And then Sophia, the smallest, her lips cracked, her body no heavier than a bundle of blankets. When she emerged, silence fell again. She looked like a ghost, too fragile to belong to the world above. But as Rex walked close, pressing his muzzle against her dangling hand, she let out the faintest sigh, not of fear, but of recognition. The crowd broke. Parents wept openly. Some clutched each other. Others pressed trembling fingers to their lips, as if to hold in prayers they had given up on weeks ago. Neighbors who had doubted, who had whispered rumors and defended illusions, now sobbed without shame. The children they had declared gone forever were here, standing on trembling legs under the pale glow of the night sky. Flashbulbs exploded as journalists captured the moment, the light burning white across the courtyard. Each flash seared the image into permanence. 3 children, dust-covered, clinging to a German shepherd, whose body formed a shield around them. Rex did not flinch at the chaos. His gaze swept the crowd, steady, protective, guiding the children as if every step was a promise. The night outside was cold. Breath rose in clouds as the crowd spilled into the courtyard, creating a narrow path. Officers carried the children forward slowly, Rex never leaving their side. His bandaged paws touched the stone with purpose, his body taut with vigilance. To the people of Belluno, it looked less like an animal walking and more like a sentinel leading the way. And in that moment, hope took form. Camera shutters clicked frantically, reporters shouting questions, but no one answered. The scene was beyond words. It belonged not to headlines, but to the collective memory of a town that had nearly drowned in despair. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers cried into their hands. The mayor stood speechless, his polished speech lost in the rawness of reality. Anna Rossi broke through at last. The officers could no longer hold her back. She threw herself toward Eleanor, arms wrapping around the girl's frail body. Elena collapsed against her mother's chest, sobbing soundlessly, her fingers still gripping Rex's fur, even as her mother kissed her face. "Don't leave him," Elena whispered, voice muffled against Anna's coat. "Don't let him go." Anna, weeping, turned her gaze toward Rex, and in her eyes was gratitude deeper than words, the kind that comes only when the impossible has been given back. Other parents pressed forward, Pietro Bianchi shouting Marco's name, his booming voice breaking into a sob that echoed across the square. Sophia's mother collapsed when she touched her daughter's hand, whispering prayers as though afraid God might take her back if she stopped speaking. Above the crowd, the church bells began to ring. Not planned, not ordered. The priest had seen the children and could not contain his trembling hands. The bells tolled wildly into the night, their sound spilling through every street, calling even those who had stayed behind in their homes. Windows opened, more people rushed into the square, and when they arrived, they saw the same sight. 3 children wrapped in coats, clinging to life, guided by a dog who walked like light had always belonged to him. Lucia Ferraro stood slightly apart, watching. Her chest ached with relief, but she held her composure, knowing the work was not yet done. The children needed doctors, rest, safety. But for now, she let the moment breathe. She let the town see with their own eyes what Rex had refused to let them deny. A journalist whispered to another, almost reverently, This is history. This moment will live forever." And he was right. For years to come, the photographs taken that night would hang in kitchens, in city halls, in the very school that had once hidden darkness. They would not show the officers' strained faces or the parents' broken cries. They would show a dog, blood still on his paws, light catching in his eyes, leading 3 children out of the shadows and into the world again. The square, filled with sobs and shouts, became a cathedral of release. No one thought of the shame, the failures, the blindness that had allowed this horror. In that moment, all anyone could see was the miracle. That when human faith had faltered, an animal's instinct had carried them through. And Rex, walking steady among the chaos, did not bask in the glory. His eyes stayed on the children. He did not see cameras or tears. He saw only what mattered. Fragile lives that needed him still. That night, Belluno would not sleep. But for the first time in months, it would not be because of fear. It would be because hope had a heartbeat again. The night that brought the children back into the light also shattered the illusion that had protected Giovanni Marchetti for so long. While parents clung to their rescued sons and daughters, while Rex stood steady in the glow of camera flashes, a different kind of silence settled on the far end of Belluno. At the edge of town, where narrow alleys wound into dim courtyards, the police gathered outside a handsome stone house with green shutters and iron balconies. Giovanni's home. It looked as respectable as the man himself had always pretended to be. Ivy crawled across its walls, neat curtains hung in every window, and a small brass plaque by the door still bore his name. To anyone else, it might have seemed ordinary. But to Detective Lucia Ferraro, standing with Rex at her side, it looked like a stage set built to hide rot. "Inside," she ordered. The officers surged forward, boots striking the cobblestones, battering ram in hand. The door splintered on the second blow, its lock snapping like a bone. They poured into the house, flashlights cutting across polished wood floors and bookshelves lined with volumes of Dante, Petrarch, and Shakespeare. The perfect collection for a man who had made his living weaving illusions of intellect. For a moment, it seemed no one was home. The rooms were too quiet, the air too still. But then, from the top of the staircase, A voice carried down, smooth, measured, mocking. "So, this is how you thank your most loyal servant?" Giovanni stood at the landing, his jacket still immaculate, his hair still combed back. His smile was faint, his tone dripping with disdain. To the untrained eye, he looked as composed as ever. But Lucia noticed the twitch in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the banister too tightly. "Giovanni Marchetti," she said, her voice hard. "You're under arrest." He laughed. Short, sharp, brittle. "On what grounds? Because a dog clawed at a floor? Because hysteria drives this town to madness?" He descended slowly, each step deliberate, his polished shoes echoing against the wood. "I am a teacher. I am a man who has given his life to your children. And this circus is your answer to my service?" Lucia gave a small nod to her officers. They spread through the house, searching room by room. Drawers were pulled open, closets inspected, every corner illuminated by harsh white beams. Giovanni's calm began to fracture. His smile twisted. His voice grew louder, harsher. "This is an outrage. Do you hear me? An outrage. You are tearing apart the home of an innocent man." But his words crumbled when an officer called from the study. "Detective, you need to see this." Lucia moved quickly, Rex at her side. The study was lined with shelves, every surface stacked with papers, journals, and notebooks bound in neat leather covers. At first glance, they seemed academic, lesson plans, notes on literature. But as the officers flipped them open, the truth bled through. Schedules, names, precise records of when certain students stayed late. Marks in margins that tracked behaviors, vulnerabilities, and worse, locks. A drawer revealed heavy padlocks, chains coiled neatly, lengths of rope knotted and frayed. The room darkened with the weight of it. Even the officers, hardened by years of crime, swallowed hard at the sight. Lucia lifted one journal carefully, flipping through pages of meticulous handwriting. Each entry was a mask torn away, revealing calculation where there should have been care. She looked up at Giovanni. "This is your innocence?" For the first time, his facade cracked. The calm drained from his face, leaving behind something raw and ugly. His eyes flared with rage. His voice spat venom. "You fools! Do you think you know what it means to guide children? To shape them? They are clay, fragile, weak, and I gave them discipline, order, purpose. And for this, you call me a monster?" His words, sharp and frantic, echoed through the house. Officers froze, shocked by the transformation. Gone was the eloquent teacher quoting Dante. In his place stood a man stripped of disguise, spitting justifications into the air like poison. Lucia's voice cut through him, steady as steel. "You call it discipline. I call it chains, and now the chains are broken." Rex barked sharply, the sound booming in the narrow room. Giovanni flinched at it, his composure collapsing fully. He lunged, not toward Lucia, but toward the journals, as though to tear them apart before the eyes of the law. Officers intercepted him, forcing him to the ground. His protests turned to roars, his denials to curses. "Lies! All lies! That dog has bewitched you! You would trust an animal over me? Over a man of learning? You are blind! Blind!" Handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The sound rang louder than any protest he made. Lucia stepped back, her gaze unyielding. She looked at Rex, whose eyes never left Giovanni, and gave a nod. The shepherd's steady breath filled the silence, as though declaring the truth no human voice could. When they dragged Giovanni through the door, the street outside erupted. Neighbors who had once defended him now shouted curses, spit striking the cobblestones. Parents clutched their children, shielding them from the sight. Cameras flashed again, catching not the polished teacher, but the man beneath, disheveled, snarling, bound. Giovanni Marchetti, once the jewel of Santa Lucia School, was unmasked. And for the first time in months, Belluno's children could breathe without the shadow of his smile. The news spread faster than the toll of the church bells. By dawn, every street in Belluno seemed to know. Giovanni Marchetti, the beloved literature teacher, the jewel of Santa Lucia, had been led away in handcuffs. For years, neighbors had praised him at dinners and weddings, speaking of his eloquence, his devotion, the way he drew brilliance out of even the most distracted children. Now, those same neighbors stood in doorways with their arms folded, shaking their heads as though the world had betrayed them. Some refused to believe it. At the bakery, Signora Romano slammed her hand on the counter when the subject arose. No, I will not hear it. Giovanni is a man of culture, of faith. He wept for our children at Mass. He tutored my niece for months without asking a lira. Lies. All of it. Police lies. Her voice trembled, but she refused to let it crack. To admit Giovanni's guilt would mean admitting she had been blind, and blindness was too heavy a burden, but others spat his name like poison. In the piazza, Pietro Bianchi, Marco's father, shouted to anyone who would listen. I said it from the start. I warned you, and you all looked away, called me mad. Now look. Look at what your silence cost us. His voice was raw, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the school, toward the church, toward the town itself. Some nodded grimly, guilt thick in their eyes. Others lowered their heads, ashamed. Giovanni's house, once admired for its ivy and polished shutters, became a scar on the street. Children walking past whispered and hurried on. Parents tugged them closer, spitting on the ground as though to cleanse the cobblestones of his memory. The brass plaque bearing his name was pried off in the night, left to rust in the gutter. Still, there were those who clung to denial. At the cafe, older men shook their heads over tiny cups of espresso. The police needed a scapegoat, one muttered. It is easier to blame a teacher than to admit their own failure. Another nodded, muttering about conspiracy, about hysteria. They remembered Giovanni's warm greetings, his measured words, the way he carried himself like a man above suspicion. They could not reconcile the mask with the monster beneath. But the evidence was already bleeding into the streets. Journals, schedules, and chains. Photographs of officers carrying them out of his home. It became harder to deny with each passing hour. And as the truth settled, guilt followed. Parents who had once sung Giovanni's praises now felt their stomachs twist when they remembered their words. Mothers remembered the trust with which they had sent their children to extra tutoring. Fathers recalled shaking Giovanni's hand at school meetings, thanking him for his devotion. The shame was unbearable. Anna Rossi sat at her kitchen table, staring at a notebook where Giovanni had once written a message for her daughter. Elena has a rare gift. Protect it. She tore the page out and burned it over the stove, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the match. Others confessed in hushed tones to the priest. I saw things, one mother whispered through tears in the confessional. The way he looked at the girls. I noticed, but I told myself I was imagining it. Father, I did nothing. The priest listened, his own voice unsteady as he offered absolution. But absolution could not erase the guilt. In the schoolyard, children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Why did Maestro Giovanni hurt them? He read us stories. He told us to be brave. Parents stumbled for words, torn between protecting innocence and telling the truth. Some said simply, he lied. Others said nothing, holding their children too tightly, as if the silence itself could shield them. The town fractured further. Streets once filled with greetings now echoed with accusations. Friends avoided each other's eyes, remembering arguments from weeks before, the heated denials, the desperate suspicions. Some bonds broke entirely, neighbors no longer speaking to one another, marriages strained under the weight of guilt. But above all, there was grief, not only for the children Giovanni had stolen away, but for the innocence of the town itself. Belluno had prided itself on trust, on community, on the safety of its narrow streets. Now that pride was ash, blown away in the cold winter wind. In the evenings, people gathered in small groups outside the church, candles flickering in trembling hands. They prayed not only for Elena, Marco, and Sofia, but for the children who had been lost in other towns, for the ones who might never return. They prayed for forgiveness, from God, from their children, from themselves. Lucia Ferraro passed through those gatherings quietly, Rex at her side. She saw the shame in their eyes, the tears on their cheeks. She did not speak, but the sight of Rex, the dog who had refused to stop scratching, was reminder enough. They had ignored their instincts. He had not. And Giovanni, the man they had once held as a symbol of pride, was now a symbol of their blindness. Every corner of Belluno felt the aftershocks. At the market, whispers replaced greetings. At the school, parents hovered nervously at the gates, unable to let their children walk alone. In the square, where Giovanni had once recited Dante during festivals, his words were now curses echoing in memory. Trust, once given so freely, had turned into something rare, fragile, and painfully earned. And though the town would try to move forward, one truth would always remain. They had embraced a wolf in shepherd's clothing, and only the relentless faith of a dog had forced them to see it. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of heart monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses moving in and out. Curtains were drawn to dim the harsh light, giving the space a hush that felt more like a chapel than a ward. On 3 separate beds lay Elena, Marco, and Sofia, their bodies wrapped in clean sheets, their skin scrubbed but still pale with exhaustion. Doctors had treated the hunger, the bruises, the dehydration, but there were wounds no medicine could reach. It was here, behind closed doors, that detectives began the hardest task: listening. They did not press the children with harsh questions or demand clarity, where there was none. Instead, they sat close, voices low, as though afraid that even sound might bruise what was already fragile. Each testimony came in fragments, in whispers. But together, the fragments formed a story no one could deny. Elena was the first to speak. Her voice was brittle, each word breaking like glass. He said, "I was special." Her eyes flickered toward her mother, who sat beside her bed clutching her hand, tears spilling silently. He said, "I had a gift, that I needed more lessons, after school." "Private." The detective nodded gently, encouraging but not interrupting. Elena's gaze dropped to the sheet pulled over her knees. "I didn't want to disappoint him. He said if I didn't come, I'd fall behind. He promised he would help me become great." Her voice trailed off, and she pressed her face into the pillow. Her mother stroked her hair, whispering, "Basta, amore. You don't need to say more." But Elena shook her head, forcing herself to continue. I trusted him. The words were almost inaudible, more confession than testimony. Marco's turn came next. He stared at the ceiling, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. For a long time he said nothing, his lips pressed together as though the silence itself were his shield. Finally, in a voice barely more than a breath, he muttered, "He told me I could be a leader, that he saw something in me no one else did." Tears welled in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. I believed him. I wanted to make my father proud. So when he asked me to stay, I did. He swallowed hard, his voice turning flat. But he locked the door. The room froze at those words. Even the machines seemed to pause. Marco shut his eyes tightly, retreating into silence again, refusing to go further. His small body trembled, and Rex, lying at the foot of his bed, lifted his head, pressing his muzzle gently against the boy's hand. Marco exhaled, a shudder more than a sigh, and clung to the shepherd as though the animal's steadiness could anchor him against the flood. Sophia, the youngest, spoke last. Her voice was little more than a whisper, so faint the detective leaned close to catch it. He said he'd keep me safe, that he was my friend. Her small fingers twisted the edge of her blanket. He brought me sweets. He said, if I told anyone, they wouldn't believe me, because he was the teacher, and I was just a girl. Her words cracked, breaking into sobs. Her mother gathered her into her arms, rocking her gently. But even through the sobs, Sophia's final words slipped out. I thought he was good. The detectives exchanged glances. They had heard enough. Each child's story, broken though it was, pointed to the same man, the same promises, the same lures. A pattern so clear that no denial could erase it. Giovanni had cloaked himself in trust, in intellect, in the role of protector, and he had used that cloak to hide his chains. The children's testimonies were not shouted accusations. They were soft, halting, delivered in voices hoarse with fear. And yet, their quiet carried more weight than any courtroom speech. Outside the hospital room, officers stood with grim faces. Word of the interviews spread quickly through the corridors. Nurses wiped at their eyes. Orderlies shook their heads in disbelief, and parents waiting in chairs clutched their children closer. The town's last thread of denial began to snap. When news reached the piazza that night, reactions were visceral. Some collapsed into grief, covering their faces as though ashamed they had ever doubted. Others spat Giovanni's name into the dirt, muttering curses through clenched teeth. Mothers who had once defended him now wept openly, their guilt unbearable. I trusted him with my child. One sobbed into her neighbor's arms. How could I not have seen? And through it all, the image of Rex remained. The children, even in their most broken moments, clung to him. They whispered into his fur, stroked his ears, pressed their faces against his steady chest. To them, he was not only a rescuer. He was proof that loyalty still existed, that not every hand reaching for them was a lie. The detectives left the hospital with their notebooks heavy, their hearts heavier still. They had gathered evidence in journals and locks, but it was the children's words that condemned Giovanni beyond redemption. And in the silence of their testimonies, Belluno finally heard the truth it had tried so long to bury. The hospital lights hummed softly, casting pale halos across polished floors. In the children's ward, fragile peace lingered as the rescued children slept. At the door lay Rex, the German shepherd whose paws had clawed truth from silence. His head rested on his paws, but Detective Lucia Ferraro, seated across the corridor, knew better. His body never fully relaxed. He wasn't resting. He was guarding. To most of Belluno, Rex was a miracle. To Lucia, he was something deeper. The other half of a vow forged years earlier in rubble and silence. She remembered their first meeting. Rex was barely 2, fiery and restless, too stubborn for most handlers. When Lucia approached his kennel, he tilted his head, eyes unblinking, as if measuring her. She crouched, silent. Minutes passed until he pressed his nose against the bars, breath fogging the metal. That was the beginning. Training was not easy. Rex ignored whistles, pulled against the leash, barked at shadows. But Lucia refused to break him down. Instead, she listened. She learned the twitch of his ear when he caught a scent, the shift in his stance when danger neared. Slowly, Rex learned her language too, the firmness in her tone, the touch of her hand on his shoulder. Trust became their bond. That trust was tested in Abruzzo, during a landslide that buried a village. After 2 days of silence, Rex pulled violently toward a collapsed barn. Hopeless, the officers muttered, but Rex clawed until his paws bled. Lucia pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "Show me." Hours later, a child was pulled out alive. For her, it was proof. Rex's relentlessness wasn't madness. It was loyalty, sharpened into instinct. Years followed. Earthquakes, missing hikers, floods. Rex leapt into rivers, dragged survivors from ruins, led Lucia into danger others could not face. Each scar in his fur, each grey strand on his muzzle, was earned in service of a promise. Leave no one behind. So when he tore at Giovanni Marchetti's classroom floor until his nails cracked, Lucia did not doubt. Others thought it hysteria. She recognized the language he had always spoken. The truth is here. Do not look away. Now, in the hospital corridor, she whispered, "You knew, when no one else wanted to see." Rex's ear flicked at her voice, though his eyes stayed closed. He didn't need to answer. When Rex entered the ward, silence shifted. His presence filled the room like light after a storm. At first, he paused beside an 8-year-old boy, curled tight in his bed. Without a sound, Rex laid his muzzle on the sheets. Slowly, the boy stretched a trembling hand to touch his fur. The first smile in weeks broke across his pale face. A nurse pressed her hand to her mouth. "He's smiling," she whispered. From bed to bed, Rex moved gently. Some children clung instantly to him, burying their faces in his coat. Others reached with hesitation, then braver the second time. One girl, hair tangled and voice thin, whispered, "You came back. I thought you'd leave, but you didn't." She wasn't only speaking to Rex. She was pleading with the world itself. "Don't leave me. Don't forget me." Lucia swallowed hard in the doorway. She knew that plea. She had once whispered it herself. The nurses murmured to each other, awe in their voices. "That's the dog," one said, "the one who wouldn't stop scratching." Another added, "The dog who listened." The phrase lingered. The dog who listened. Rex lowered himself onto the floor, and one by one the children gathered. Hands trembled against his fur. For the first time, the ward filled with the fractured, fragile sound of laughter. Doctors had spoken of years of therapy ahead. Yet here, healing began in the simple presence of a dog who had refused to abandon them. One boy clung to Rex's neck, whispering into his fur, "I told them you'd find us." Rex stood steady, bearing the weight of those words. Hardened nurses wiped their eyes. "It's as if he knows exactly what they need," one murmured. And perhaps he did. That night, the children slept more deeply than they had since their ordeal began, hands still tangled in Rex's coat. The head nurse whispered to Lucia, "He's done more in an hour than we could in weeks." He gave them back hope. It began with a photograph, Rex leading frightened children out of the cellar, their hands clinging to his fur. A paramedic's image hit the front page of a local paper, then spread across Italy. Headlines blazed. "The dog who saved our children." Rex, Italy's four-legged hero. Television replayed the body cam footage of Rex scratching furiously at the cellar door, refusing to move until it opened. Italians who had grown cynical about justice found themselves crying at their screens. Letters flooded the Belluno police station. Crayon drawings, shaky handwriting. "Grazie, Rex. We believe in heroes again. Tell him we love him." An elderly widow mailed her husband's police medal with a note. "He served with honor. Rex deserves this more than anyone." Soon, gifts arrived. Handmade collars, embroidered quilts, boxes of treats, bouquets for his kennel, a silver food bowl engraved, "The dog who listened." The K9 unit assigned 2 officers just to sort the deliveries. Television crews descended. Parents spoke through tears. My daughter smiled for the first time when she saw Rex. She sleeps holding a drawing of him. Schools invited him to assemblies. Hospitals asked for visits. Churches lit candles. A famous tenor offered a concert to raise funds for K9 units. And then, the children themselves wrote letters. Shaky, misspelled, piercingly sincere. "Rex saved us. He told me not to be scared. I love him because he stayed." When a news anchor read them aloud on prime time, millions wept. In Rome, officials called him a symbol of loyalty that transcends species. Petitions urged Parliament to create a national day honoring service dogs. Some said Rex reminded Italians of what was pure in a time stained by corruption and scandal. But Rex remained unchanged. Indifferent to cameras, he lay quietly by Lucia's side, his world rooted in duty, not fame. To her, that indifference was his greatness. One evening, the town square of Belluno filled with candles lit in his honor. Lucia knelt beside her partner, stroking the ridge of his back. "You've become Italy's hope," she whispered. "But to me, you're still just Rex, the one who never let go." Rex pressed his head against her shoulder, unbothered by the cameras flashing around them. For him, the world was not headlines or accolades. It was this: the children safe, the bond unbroken, the vow fulfilled. And as thousands of candles flickered across the square and millions of hearts beat in unison across the nation, Italy realized what Lucia had always known: that a dog had reminded them of something too easily forgotten. That loyalty, when unyielding, can heal even the deepest wounds. The courtroom in Belluno felt heavier than stone. Sunlight poured through arched windows, dust motes drifting like reluctant witnesses. Every bench was filled. Parents, journalists, officers, townsfolk drawn to see the man whose name had become a curse. Giovanni entered in chains, yet his posture was erect, his suit pressed, his eyes cold and glassy. He looked at the crowd with unsettling calm, and when his gaze fixed, even reporters shifted uneasily. His lawyers wasted no time. "This case," one began, "is not built on fact, But hysteria. Children are impressionable. They can be coached. We risk condemning an innocent man for the shadows. He even gestured toward Rex, lying by Detective Lucia Ferraro's feet. Even the dog has been woven into this mythology. Dogs do not testify. Yet the world bows to his story. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Parents tightened their hold on the very children Giovanni had harmed. And when Giovanni allowed himself a faint smile, cold, amused, the chill in the room deepened. The prosecutor countered, stacking testimonies high. But even before evidence was laid out, Giovanni's stare betrayed him more than words could. Then the parents spoke. A mother clutched a photograph of her 8-year-old. "She used to laugh about her missing teeth," she whispered. "After him, she doesn't laugh. She wakes screaming, begging me not to let go." A father's voice thundered through the chamber. He held up a photo of his son at a soccer match, wild-haired and grinning. He loved that ball. Now he won't touch it. He just curls into the corner of his bed. That man, he pointed at Giovanni, his hand shaking, robbed me of fatherhood. One by one, voices broke open the silence. Mothers who searched alleys for days. Fathers who now kept vigil outside bedroom doors. Parents clutching stuffed animals their children no longer wanted. Relics of innocence stolen. A mother held up 2 photographs. Her daughter before, radiant with ribbons in her hair. After, hollow-eyed and pale. "Do you see?" she cried. "This is what you did. You turned her into a shadow. And that shadow will haunt you long after this trial ends." The gallery erupted in sobs. Even seasoned reporters lowered their cameras. Through it all, Giovanni sat motionless, cold, unrepentant. His lawyers objected to emotional manipulation, but the judge allowed the parents' truth to be spoken. For justice, evidence alone was not enough. The air itself needed to carry their grief. At last, the jury returned. Pale, unreadable, they filed in. The forewoman unfolded the verdict, her voice steady. On all counts, guilty. The chamber broke open. Mothers wept. Fathers clasped shoulders in raw relief. Applause swelled, not of triumph, but release. Years of silence and fear collapsed into one roar of vindication. Giovanni did not flinch. His stare stayed fixed on some distant point. But when guards led him past Rex, the shepherd lifted his head, gaze steady, unblinking. Giovanni looked away first. People noticed. Later, many would say Rex saw something in Giovanni's soul no human eye could bear. The judge's words echoed like thunder. "Giovanni Moretti, you preyed on the innocent. You abused sacred trust. Trust broken is trust forever lost. For that, you will lose the freedom you used to destroy lives." Applause surged again, mingled with tears. Parents held up photographs of children, not as victims, but as survivors. Some knelt beside Rex, running trembling hands through his fur, whispering thanks the dog could not understand, but perhaps felt. Outside, crowds cheered. Candles lit the courthouse steps, surrounded by flowers and children's drawings. A banner, painted with shaky hands, read, "Grazie, Rex." Inside, as the courtroom emptied, one little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and pointed at the shepherd. Her whisper carried like a prayer. "Mama, that's the dog who told me not to be afraid." That night, Italy watched footage of the verdict on every screen. Giovanni's cold stare, the judge's thunderous words, the eruption of cheers, and the image already destined to be iconic. Rex, calm and unflinching as justice was delivered. Letters poured into the canine unit. Gifts arrived again. Collars, blankets, toys. One child wrote in uneven scrawl, "Thank you for listening when no one else would." The scars of families would remain. Healing would take years. But that day in Belluno, justice prevailed, and at its center stood a silent sentinel. Rex, the dog who listened when the world tried to look away. The hospital lights hummed softly, casting pale halos across polished floors. In the children's ward, fragile peace lingered as the rescued children slept. At the door lay Rex, the German shepherd, whose paws had clawed truth from silence. His head rested on his paws, but Detective Lucia Ferraro, seated across the corridor, knew better. His body never fully relaxed. He wasn't resting. He was guarding. To most of Belluno, Rex was a miracle. To Lucia, he was something deeper. The other half of a vow forged years earlier in rubble and silence. She remembered their first meeting. Rex was barely 2, fiery and restless, too stubborn for most handlers. When Lucia approached his kennel, he tilted his head, eyes unblinking, as if measuring her. She crouched, silent. Minutes passed until he pressed his nose against the bars, breath fogging the metal. That was the beginning. Training was not easy. Rex ignored whistles, pulled against the leash, barked at shadows. But Lucia refused to break him down. Instead, she listened. She learned the twitch of his ear when he caught a scent, the shift in his stance when danger neared. Slowly, Rex learned her language too. The firmness in her tone, the touch of her hand on his shoulder. Trust became their bond. That trust was tested in Abruzzo, during a landslide that buried a village. After 2 days of silence, Rex pulled violently toward a collapsed barn. "Hopeless," the officers muttered, but Rex clawed until his paws bled. Lucia pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "Show me." Hours later, a child was pulled out alive. For her, it was proof. Rex's relentlessness wasn't madness. It was loyalty, sharpened into instinct. Years followed. Earthquakes, missing hikers, floods. Rex leapt into rivers, dragged survivors from ruins, led Lucia into danger others could not face. Each scar in his fur, each grey strand on his muzzle, was earned in service of a promise: leave no one behind. So when he tore at Giovanni Marchetti's classroom floor until his nails cracked, Lucia did not doubt. Others thought it hysteria. She recognized the language he had always spoken. The truth is here. Do not look away. Now. In the hospital corridor, she whispered, "You knew," when no one else wanted to see. Rex's ear flicked at her voice, though his eyes stayed closed. He didn't need to answer. When Rex entered the ward, silence shifted. His presence filled the room like light after a storm. At first, he paused beside an 8-year-old boy curled tight in his bed. Without a sound, Rex laid his muzzle on the sheets. Slowly, the boy stretched a trembling hand to touch his fur. The first smile in weeks broke across his pale face. A nurse pressed her hand to her mouth. "He's smiling," she whispered. From bed to bed, Rex moved gently. Some children clung instantly to him, burying their faces in his coat. Others reached with hesitation, then braver the second time. One girl, hair tangled and voice thin, whispered, "You came back. I thought you'd leave." But you didn't. She wasn't only speaking to Rex. She was pleading with the world itself. Don't leave me. Don't forget me. Lucia swallowed hard in the doorway. She knew that plea. She had once whispered it herself. The nurses murmured to each other, awe in their voices. That's the dog, one said. The one who wouldn't stop scratching. Another added, the dog who listened. The phrase lingered. The dog who listened. Rex lowered himself onto the floor, and one by one, the children gathered. Hands trembled against his fur. For the first time, the ward filled with the fractured, fragile sound of laughter. Doctors had spoken of years of therapy ahead. Yet here, healing began in the simple presence of a dog who had refused to abandon them. One boy clung to Rex's neck, whispering into his fur, "I told them you'd find us." Rex stood steady, bearing the weight of those words. Hardened nurses wiped their eyes. "It's as if he knows exactly what they need," one murmured. And perhaps he did. That night, the children slept more deeply than they had since their ordeal began, hands still tangled in Rex's coat. The head nurse whispered to Lucia, "He's done more in an hour than we could in weeks." He gave them back hope. It began with a photograph. Rex leading frightened children out of the cellar, their hands clinging to his fur. A paramedic's image hit the front page of a local paper, then spread across Italy. Headlines blazed, "The dog who saved our children." Rex, Italy's four-legged hero. Television replayed the body cam footage of Rex scratching furiously at the cellar door, refusing to move until it opened. Italians who had grown cynical about justice found themselves crying at their screens. Letters flooded the Belluno police station. Crayon drawings, shaky handwriting. "Grazie, Rex. We believe in heroes again. Tell him we love him." An elderly widow mailed her husband's police medal with a note. "He served with honor. Rex deserves this more than anyone." Soon, gifts arrived. Handmade collars, embroidered quilts, boxes of treats, bouquets for his kennel. A silver food bowl engraved, "The dog who listened." The canine unit assigned 2 officers just to sort the deliveries. The courtroom in Belluno felt heavier than stone. Every bench was filled. Giovanni entered in chains, posture erect, his eyes cold and glassy. His lawyers painted him as a victim of hysteria, children as impressionable. One even gestured toward Rex. "A dog cannot testify," he sneered. Gasps rippled. Parents clutched their children. Giovanni allowed himself a faint smile, cold and amused, and the chill deepened. Then the parents spoke. "She was 8, one mother whispered, clutching a photograph. She laughed about her missing teeth. After him, she wakes screaming, begging me not to let go." A father thundered, holding up his son's photo. "He loved soccer. Now he curls into a corner. That man robbed me of fatherhood." One by one, testimonies poured out. Mothers who searched alleys for nights, fathers who kept vigil by doors, parents clutching torn drawings and stuffed animals. A mother held up 2 photos. Her daughter before, radiant. After, hollow-eyed. "Do you see? You turned her into a shadow. And that shadow will haunt you long after this trial ends." The gallery wept. Reporters lowered cameras. Even the judge's eyes brimmed. Through it all, Giovanni sat motionless. Finally, the jury returned. On all counts, guilty. The chamber broke open. Mothers wept. Fathers embraced. Applause swelled, not of triumph, but of release. The judge's words thundered. "You preyed on the innocent. You abused sacred trust. For that, You will lose the freedom you used to destroy lives. As Giovanni was led past, Rex lifted his head, gaze steady. Giovanni looked away first. The next morning, Rome awoke to headlines that cut like knives. Betrayal within our schools. A child's trust broken forever. Commentators shouted, "How could this happen under our watch?" Politicians scrambled. Emergency sessions, school inspections, committees. Parents' grief-filled interviews became both confession and warning. Schools held emergency meetings, districts flooded with calls. Posters appeared at children's eye level. If something feels wrong, tell. Rex's role was never forgotten. His image circulated as the silent sentinel. Letters poured into the K9 unit. Editors wrote, "He saw what humans missed." The first vigil began in Belluno, candles flickering on church steps. Bells tolled not only for Elena, Marco, and Sofia, but for children whose names were never found. Soon bells rang in Padua, Verona, Naples. Families pressed shoulder to shoulder, candles in palms, paper cranes hanging from lampposts. A plaque in Belluno's town hall read, "You were brave where we were blind. Forgive us. Thank you." Children drifted to Rex during vigils, small hands resting in his fur. He became a place to rest. Schools reformed. Glass doors, dual supervision, anonymous reporting boxes. Teachers practiced saying, "I hear you. Thank you for telling me." Parents reminded, "Trust is a bridge. Inspect it. Don't burn it." In Milan, the first mural appeared. Rex in black and gold, children's silhouettes behind him. Caption: "When humans failed, he did not." Rome, Florence, Naples followed. Children wore shirts with his image. Therapists kept small figurines of him for survivors. Globally, his story spread. Tributes in Brazil, poems in Japan, marches in the US. An editorial wrote, "Rex is Italy's conscience. His bark is the sound of justice in a country too long deaf to its own failures." Rex himself lived quietly, under care, changed, but unbroken. Sometimes he sat still, listening, as if to echoes no one else could hear. From Belluno to Rome, from headlines to murals, Rex became more than a dog. He became proof that loyalty and instinct can pierce the silence where institutions fail. And in every mural, every candle, every child's drawing, the same truth echoed. When humanity faltered, a dog refused to look away. The verdict had been delivered. Giovanni was led away in shackles, but the story did not end at the courtroom's doors. For the children who survived, the true trial had only just begun. Freedom had come like a sudden rush of daylight through a long, sealed cellar, brilliant, overwhelming, and frightening. Shadows did not vanish overnight. At a rehabilitation center outside Milan, pastel-colored rooms tried to replace the gray cells of captivity. Drawings of sunflowers and houses under bright suns were pinned to corkboards, but the air still carried an invisible weight. Nurses called it the silence between breaths. At night, screams still pierced the halls. Matteo, a boy of 7, would press himself against the wall at the faintest click of a door, whispering that the footsteps are coming back. It took 3 adults to convince him the shadows on the floor were only moonlight. Sophia, no older than 6, clutched a worn stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. When a social worker tried to wash it, she collapsed on the ground, gasping, as though stripped of her last defense. They gave it back immediately. Even at mealtimes, trauma showed itself. Some children stuffed rolls of bread into their sleeves, convinced food would be taken away. Parents who came to visit found reunions complicated. Some children clung desperately to them. Others stood frozen, unable to step forward, their trust rewritten by cruelty. Doctors described the recovery as fractured but alive. Smiles flickered behind fear, and every step forward risked a stumble back into shadows. In the therapy room, the children were once asked to draw what safe felt like. Pencils hovered over blank pages, until Luca, a boy with dark curls who had barely spoken, sketched a dog, pointed ears, wagging tail. "Rex," another child whispered. Something shifted. Crayons pressed harder against paper. Dogs appeared on nearly every sheet. Golden, black, winged, glowing, but always with kind eyes. Rex had not only rescued them during the raid, he had become their symbol of safety, a presence that had never betrayed them. Therapists seized on these sparks. They encouraged laughter, music, and drawing. Silence, once the language of captivity, was no longer forced. And slowly, fragile miracles emerged. A little girl dared to skip across the therapy floor. A boy whispered his first words in months. "Can I have more soup?" Children played tag in the courtyard, their shrieks of joy indistinguishable from others, until a truck backfired, and all of them dropped flat to the ground. Healing was not straight, but winding, uneven. Caregivers stayed beside them through nightmares, holding small hands until the tide of fear ebbed. And everywhere, in drawings, in whispered words, Rex reappeared, anchoring them against the dark. One boy, Marco, drew Rex every week, ears upright, stance steady, eyes that never left them. "He didn't leave us," Marco said. The therapists realized it was more than memory. Rex had become trust itself. The idea soon surfaced. If Rex's presence had anchored them, could other dogs help carry them further into light? The first therapy session was tentative. 2 golden retrievers lay quietly on the floor, not approaching, just waiting. At first the children froze. And then Sophia slid from her chair, pressed her hand into one retriever's fur, and sighed. The dog exhaled deeply, steady and calm, as if to say, "You are safe." Others followed. Fingers tangled in fur, giggles replaced silence. Children who avoided eye contact now leaned forward, whispering into ears that asked nothing in return. "They just stay," one child said simply. More dogs came, labs, collies, even rescues with scars of their own. The children seemed to recognize themselves in these animals who had also been abandoned, yet still wagged their tails. Healing became a two-way street. Broken children comforting broken animals, each reflecting resilience back to the other. And always, Rex's name was present. Murals of him appeared on therapy walls, in city streets, in newspapers. He had become not only the savior of a night, but the guide through the days after. Word spread. Italy, wounded and ashamed, clung to this unexpected path to healing. Schools introduced therapy dogs into classrooms. Hospitals welcomed them into pediatric wards. Communities fundraised for animal-assisted programs. A doctor in Milan recounted how a child who hadn't spoken for months whispered his first word, amico, friend, while hugging a shaggy sheepdog. "It was as if Rex's spirit walked with us," she said. Families noticed change, too. A mother admitted she no longer braced herself for screams at night. Her daughter now whispered instead to the dog at her feet. "I don't mind," she said. "I'm just grateful she whispers at all." These victories were small but monumental. Trauma had not vanished, but it had loosened its grip. Whispers, laughter, tentative steps, each one a triumph. Delegations from across Europe came to study the Italian model. In Rome, psychologists repeated the phrase, "Rex showed us the way." Murals bloomed, children with dogs at their side, castles guarded by fur and loyalty. Art became both memorial and manifesto. When words fail, presence speaks. One evening, at a candlelight vigil, survivors stepped onto a stage with their therapy dogs. The crowd hushed. A tiny girl gripped the microphone, her voice trembling. Rex taught us that dogs don't leave. They don't lie. They don't forget. They help us be brave. And we are learning to be brave again. The audience erupted, not for officials, but for children who had carved their own path back to light, hand in paw, step by step. In one therapy session, weeks later, the story's heart revealed itself. Sophia, clutching her stuffed rabbit, slid from her chair and pressed against Rex's side. She dropped the rabbit, rested her cheek on his fur, and whispered so faintly it nearly disappeared. "You saved me. I'll never forget." The room stilled. Therapists blinked back tears. Parents covered their mouths. Rex nudged his nose against her hair, not understanding words, but understanding tone, heartbeat, presence. He knew trust had been returned piece by piece. From that moment, the phrase became a refrain. Children repeated it like a prayer. "He saved us." Journalists wrote it. Teachers carried it into classrooms. Murals bore it in shaky letters. "Safe with Rex. Rex is brave. Rex saved me." It was more than gratitude. It was a vow that the darkness of captivity would never erase the light of survival. That memory could be transformed into strength. In time, Italy would remember not only a scandal, but a rebirth. Where shame had once lingered, therapy dogs now carried light. The children were scarred, yes, but alive. And life meant hope. In drawings, taped to refrigerators, in whispered words at bedtime, in therapy sessions across the nation, Rex remained. Not just rescuer, not just therapy dog, but sanctuary. Healing did not begin with grand reforms. It began with a single whispered promise between a child and the dog who refused to let her be forgotten. And from that promise, a nation healed. The years passed like slow rivers carving through stone. What was once raw pain began to settle into something quieter, something that no longer ruled every waking breath, but still lingered like faint shadows at the edges of memory. The children, no longer children, had grown into young adults. Their lives became a testament to survival, each scar a silent story of nights they thought they would never see the dawn. In a sunlit classroom in Florence, Anna, now 20, stood at a chalkboard teaching English. Her voice was calm but firm, her eyes soft whenever a student stumbled over a word. She remembered too vividly what it meant to be voiceless, trapped in silence, praying someone would hear. To her, language was not just vocabulary, it was freedom. A faint scar traced her wrist, peeking out when she gestured to the board. She never hid it. It was proof, fractured but alive. In Rome, Matteo found another calling. He spent afternoons volunteering at a dog shelter, where animals rescued from neglect waited for second chances. He knelt by kennels, whispering softly, his hands steady against trembling muzzles. Each time a shepherd pressed its head into his palm, Matteo felt he was paying forward the loyalty that had once saved his life. Sometimes, He still woke up gasping at night, hearing phantom footsteps. But when a dog nudged his hand, the panic ebbed. Healing, he knew, was not straight. It was a winding road, lit by eyes that saw without judgment. Lucia, once the quietest of them all, discovered her voice in music. At 21, she played violin in Milan's piazzas, the bow gliding across strings with aching beauty. Crowds gathered not just to hear, but to feel the grief and hope in each note. She played as if every song was a prayer, for those who hadn't survived and for those still learning how to live. Sometimes she noticed strangers crying softly, and she understood. Trauma was not hers alone to carry. Through her music, others remembered that beauty could grow from brokenness. Though scattered across Italy, they never drifted far from one another. Once a year they gathered in a quiet park in Bologna, where a bronze statue of Rex now stood, captured mid-stride, ears pricked, gaze fixed toward a horizon only he could see. At the base were 3 words etched in stone: Fede oltre paura, faith beyond fear. The reunions were modest but sacred. They sat on the grass in the statue's shadow, sharing updates, laughter, sometimes tears they never showed elsewhere. They didn't need to explain why sudden noises still made them flinch, or why trust sometimes faltered. Among each other, they were understood. They were family, not by blood, but by survival. At their 10th reunion, Anna placed a sunflower at the statue's base. The others followed with small offerings: a sketch, a folded note, a scrap of music. Not for Rex alone, but for the parts of themselves still needing reassurance that they had been worth saving. "I used to think survival was the end," Matteo said softly, looking up at the bronze shepherd. "But it's just the beginning, isn't it?" Lucia nodded, violin case resting across her knees. "We carry him with us, not just Rex, but what he stood for: trust, courage, love that doesn't fade in the dark. It shines brighter." The town had also built another monument, a simple stone carved with Rex's image, beside words etched in marble: "To Rex, and to the children whose voices turned silence into truth." Every year, on the anniversary of the rescue, people gathered here. Survivors, families, neighbors, even strangers who had only heard whispers of the story came with candles. By nightfall, the monument glowed with hundreds of flames, like fallen stars burning against the dark. That year, Matteo arrived first, his limp still present, but his stride steady. He pressed scarred fingers to the stone. Behind him came Sophia, clutching daisies. She laid them down and whispered something only the marble could hear. Lucia rested her forehead briefly against the carving, while Alessandro, now in a soldier's jacket, placed a firm hand on the engraving. "He never left us," he said quietly. Matteo nodded. The villagers had not built the monument out of wealth, but necessity. They needed a place where grief and gratitude could coexist. Some feared it would reopen wounds, but the survivors themselves had insisted. "If we stay silent," Sophia had told the town, her voice trembling but strong, "then it's like none of it happened. We need something that says we were here, that he was here." That night the square overflowed. Tourists joined locals, carrying lanterns. The air smelled of wax and wildflowers. Candles trembled in the breeze, but did not go out. Sophia spoke, her voice steadier than it had ever been. "We gather not to remember pain, but to remember love. The kind that keeps you alive when nothing else can. Rex gave us that, and so did those who chose to believe us when we were afraid. She paused, her gaze lifting toward the carved eyes glistening in candlelight. This is more than a monument. It's a promise that no child should ever suffer in silence again, that no animal's loyalty should ever be forgotten. Later, after the crowd dispersed, the survivors sat in a circle at the monument's base, candles flickering at their feet. "Do you still hear him?" Matteo asked, his voice low. Lucia smiled faintly. "Every time I'm afraid, I hear his pause, his breathing, like he's telling me to keep going." Sophia traced the carved name with her fingers. "He didn't just save us. He carried us, even after. I don't think we'd be here without him." Alessandro, straight-backed in uniform, cleared his throat. "That's why I joined. To be that for someone else, maybe not in the same way, but to keep someone alive when they think it's over." Before leaving, each placed something at the base. Matteo, a wooden carving of a paw. Lucia, a ribbon-marked journal. Alessandro, his military patch. Sophia, her daisies. Then, hands clasped as they once had in the dark, they whispered together, "We'll come back. Every year. Always." The promise did not need to be loud. The stone carried it, the candles carried it, and in the night air, Rex's story lived on. One evening, years later, the rain had just ended, washing the streets clean. Clouds broke into a wounded sunset, streaks of crimson fighting to stay. Detective Lucia Rossi stood near the monument, its surface glistening under drizzle, Rex seated at her side. Children's voices drifted faintly from a nearby street, laughter rising like fragile music. She closed her eyes. She remembered when such voices had been swallowed by fear, silenced in hidden rooms. She remembered the hollow tree, the terrified whispers, the broken trust, and Rex, always Rex, his bark tearing through the silence when no one else had listened. "Do you know what you did, Rex?" she whispered, her voice worn but tender. "You taught us all to listen, not to words, but to the silence beneath them, the silence children carried in their eyes when no one believed them, the silence that almost buried them." Rex turned his head, eyes catching the last light. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. Rossi thought of the survivors, grown now, carving out futures. Some had stayed, some had left, but all carried scars that proved resilience. And she knew this. Their strength was not born only from therapy or justice, but from a dog who refused to walk past their pain. The monument before her was small, but its engraving read, "To those who chose to speak, and to those who never stopped listening." Each year, candles were lit, bending in the wind, but never extinguished. Each year, Rossi returned, not out of duty, but gratitude. She remembered the night she first brought Rex home after the case ended, when he curled at her feet and slept deeply for the first time. That night she realized what haunted her still. The courts, the laws, the adults had failed, but a dog had kept the thread of hope intact. "Maybe that's what frightens me most," she murmured. "That it took you, Rex, to remind us of our humanity. We, with all our words, couldn't see, and yet you just knew." She leaned her forehead to his, voice soft. "We can't save them all, old friend, but some are enough to change the world. Rex let out a low rumble, almost like agreement. The bells of a nearby church tolled, rolling across the square. Rossi lifted her gaze to the first timid stars. And she thought of childhood summers, of innocence too fragile, of how easily silence could become a grave. Then she looked back at Rex. "The silence will never fool us again," she whispered. She turned to leave, Rex walking beside her, their steps echoing on the wet stones. Behind them, the monument glowed with candles, flames small but steady, fragile but alive. And for the first time in years, Detective Rossi allowed herself to smile. Sometimes the stories we share about dogs aren't just about animals at all. They're about us, about the bonds we build, and the way love and loyalty can carry us through even the darkest places. German Shepherds, with their steady eyes and faithful hearts, remind us that true connection doesn't always need words. They give us trust, protection, and a kind of devotion that's hard to put into language, but easy to feel deep inside. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt understood without speaking, you know what I mean. That's the quiet miracle of these relationships. They remind us that love can be simple, steadfast, and healing. If you'd like to explore ways to strengthen that bond with your own dog, there's a resource I've come across that you may find meaningful. It isn't anything flashy, just thoughtful guidance for folks who want to connect more deeply with their four-legged companions. I'll leave the link here, and you can take a look if it feels right. Because in the end, the best gift we can give our dogs is the same one they've given us all along: love that never leaves.